Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof, and I'm pleased to be joined by Chip Gibbons, who is a policy director for Defending Rights and Dissent. Thanks for joining, Chip.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
Give me one moment. I have no audio in my ears and cannot understand. So 1 second here. Let me make sure that I am able to hear you. Why can't I hear you? Why do I have no audio? Well, let's do this. Chrome tab. To share this.
Saying some stuff, and there might be like a knee-jerk reaction to clap, or just because it's a crowd of people here. I just want if everybody would please to resist that urge and just understand that nothing that I'm going to be talking about is really clap worthy. But understandably, I'm pretty nervous. This is my second time doing this, and I failed public speaking in college, which is about as much college as I got. So, but I definitely want to send thanks to Cody, especially Nor for helping over.
Oh, all right. So let's try this again. I had a little technical issue, and I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and I'm pleased to be joined by Chip Gibbons, who's a policy director for Defending Rights and Dissent. And since you can hear me and I can hear you, thanks for joining. You were at the sentencing hearing for Daniel Hale, and of course the headline for today is that Daniel Hale was given a 45-month prison sentence, and we can get to the specific sentence, talk about the time he received. But let's really go back to what the hearing was like. You were there early in the morning, and you do a fair amount of work on these types of cases, and it's like probably your first time in a courtroom. So share with us some of your observations of being at the courthouse.
Yeah, it was a really emotional day and sort of a roller coaster ride. And I think one thing that took a lot of people by surprise was how long the hearing took. A lot of people thought it'd be over very quickly. Per the schedule, it's supposed to be at 9 and end at 10. There were a number of other things on the docket at 9. So they didn't really get to Daniel Hale's sentencing until almost 10 o'clock, at which point the prosecution had everyone kicked out of the courtroom so they could have this classified hearing. This is supposed to be an open court hearing, but they were having a classified or secret portion of it where the courtroom was cleared. Only his lawyers were allowed in. It's not clear to me what was being spoken about, but the prosecution said that there was a dispute of facts between them and the defense, and that this dispute would have to be resolved by references to the classified annex that was submitted to the judge. And, we were all kicked out, and I think people thought maybe we'd be out there for 10 or 15 minutes, but nearly an hour and a half went by before we were allowed back in the courtroom. So first of all, it's very, very unusual for a public court to be closed to the public, so there could be this sort of classified argument that goes on for an hour and a half. When we returned, they had the sentencing argument. It was still not clear what precisely happened during the classified portion, although I do know the defense's sentencing memo referenced that in the classified annex that the prosecution had tried to bring these charges against Hale before and were denied so by political leadership in the Obama administration. And then under the Trump course, they sort of reversed course, and they implied that the prosecution had been dishonest about this. But I honestly don't know. So we return. The prosecutor gets up there. It's a very notorious prosecutor who is involved in the Sammy Al Aaron prosecution, Palestinian academic persecuted by the U.S. government. This man has released his diaries where he refers to the Palestinian West Bank as Judea and Samara. So clearly a sort of ideologue, extremist type. And he gets up there and just starts, making all of these very sorts of inflammatory arguments about Hale. He claims Hale wasn't motivated by his conscience, but that Daniel Hale wanted to pursue a career in journalism. Daniel Hale has never pursued a career in journalism, but that, he argued he wanted to pursue a career in journalism, and that by giving these documents to a journalist, he thought that he could do this. They also made the claim that this was a premeditated crime, that the NGA where he was a contractor at, he applied for that job in order to steal these documents and give to the reporters. And then also the claim was that Daniel Hale helped ISIS, right? The prosecutor flat out said that Hale helped ISIS, whether or not he intended to or not, he did. And then finally he said, we learned nothing about U.S. foreign policy from Daniel Hale's disclosure. So there was no public interest to them because we learned nothing about them, and they contributed in no way to the discussion of drone warfare. And of course, that is blatantly untrue. The defense got up there and rebutted a lot of that. They pointed out that, Daniel Hale had access to these documents in the Air Force. If this was a premeditated plot, he could have given them out then. That Hale was, didn't go looking for this job, that his CEO helped him, that one of the things the prosecution had cited as evidence of some sort of premeditated intent was what Hale put on his resume as his life objective. But as the defense pointed out, that was written by the military when he was leaving the Air Force. A huge amount of the defense's arguments also sort of dealt with mental health issues that Mr. Hale had. Those are in the public record. I want to be very sensitive about them because they're not, I don't think really anyone's business, but they were a factor in the sentencing. And then finally, Daniel Hale asked to speak, and he stood up and read a 6-page speech, I believe what he called it, and he was, on the verge or in tears. During parts of it, he started by thanking his defense counsel. He thanked the judge. he thanked the prosecutors, which was interesting, and he talked about his sort of own experiences with the drone program and why it led him to take the actions he did. He talked about how he was related to Nathaniel Hale, who was a, I guess, U.S. patriot during the Revolutionary War for Independence, who was convicted of espionage and executed, and said, "I regret, but I have but one life to give for my country." Daniel Hale also said that as well. And there's some statements from his, one of the most moving statements from Hale was that, "I am here because I stole something that was never mine to take, precious human life. For that I was compensated and given a medal. I couldn't keep living in a world in which people pretended that things weren't happening that were. Please, Your Honor, forgive me for taking pieces of paper instead of human lives." And Hale talked about his opposition to the death penalty and his belief that killing was always wrong, but that killing defenseless people were particularly wrong, and that sort of his revulsion at drone warfare led him to take the actions he did to give information to a journalist. The judge then finally chimes in, and it was a sort of a journey, because the judge's sort of speech or rationale for her sentencing was kind of all over the place, and at times it seemed like it was going to go really well, and at other times I got very anxious. So he starts off by talking about all of the outpouring of support for Daniel Hale, mentioning all of the letters he's received from veterans families, journalists, others, and that many people believe Daniel Hale to be courageous and conscientious. And then he said, and this took me off guard, that yes, Daniel Hale is courageous and conscientious. His actions in speaking out against drone warfare show great courage. This is true. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be a surprise. But then the judge moves into, but that's not why you're here today. That's not why you're on trial. You didn't plead guilty to exposing civilian casualties or speaking out against drone warfare. You're not on trial for speaking at Code Pink events. He specifically called out Code Pink events. You're on trial for taking this bits of information and giving it to a journalist. I believe you're driven in part by conscience, but I also think you wanted to impress this journalist in order to build a career in journalism, or just sort of impress him. And at one point, he actually used Jeremy Scahill's name. I mean, it's been pretty clear who the journalist was and who the publication was and all of this, but they always do this thing where they don't ever name them. But at one point during the judge's sentencing, he actually referred to Mr. Scahill as opposed to just the journalist. I was a little bit surprised by that. And he sort of said, you were trying to impress him to move on with your career. A lot of this information was about drone warfare. He then started to mention that one of the documents exposed that U.S. did not have good intelligence gathering capabilities in the Horn of Africa, at which point the prosecutor jumped up and stopped the judge, and the judge said, "Oh, is that classified?" So like the prosecutor literally stopping the judge from speaking by saying, thing is classified. And then there was a sidebar at the bench, and then he came on and continued on with this. And I was, really quite disturbed, especially since the prosecution was arguing that they needed this 7 to 9 year sentence as general deterrence to deter other whistleblowers. And the judge did say, yes, we need a substantial sentence to deter other whistleblowers, but he rejected the guidelines of the prosecutor, saying there was a number of mitigating circumstances, including that Daniel Hale is someone of conscience who spent a lot of time speaking out for good. The length of the proceedings against him, that he was first raided in 2014. This has been going on for 7 years now. 7 years. That the trial was delayed because of COVID. There was the elongated proceeding. Then again, referencing sort of Daniel Hale's upbringing and sort of other trauma in his life. Both the judge and the defense criticized the military for ever putting Daniel Hale in the drone program, arguing that there was something in his background that I believe was under seal that they knew about that meant the military should never have put him in this situation, and that since Hale had suffered quite a bit in life, both from sort of pre-existing trauma and from the trauma of war, that the guidelines didn't apply, but a substantial sentence was still needed to show the seriousness of the crime and to deter others from doing the same thing. He then announced 45 months, which with time will be taken off for time served already. So that's a 3-year, 9-month sentence, which is a long time. I don't want to make light of it, and is, too long for a whistleblower to go to jail, but was only 1/3 of what the government was asking for, and was in fact shorter than sort of recent sentences given, like the one to Reality Winner. As Daniel Hale was taken out of the court by the U.S. Marshals, and the courtroom was quite filled with supporters. I mean, people stood up and waved at him and said, "We're going to see you again soon. Thank you for following your conscience and not the U.S. government." And of course, the prosecutor is standing right there, having to witness all of this. I can only imagine what was going through his mind. So that's sort of the entire 2-3, and I guess we got there at 9, and I don't think we got out until like 12:30.
Yeah, so we can work backwards here, but I am struck by how long it took to get to the proceeding, and also I'll say that I was tracking the schedule for these proceedings and how the judge had a number of cases on his schedule. This is Judge Liam O'Grady, and there were 6 people that he planned to get through, 6 different defendants, including Daniel Hale, in 1 hour. So I kept thinking that they're going to reduce the sentencing hearing to one where he really doesn't get a fair hearing. My judgment before, which is to say that I'm glad Daniel Hale had a chance to actually address the court and say what he wanted, like people in prior cases, especially those who are accused of what we could consider political offenses. I've been to those cases. Without being able to hear from them, there isn't any chance for them to share what is on their mind. I'm thinking of Espionage Act cases, but I'm also thinking of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act cases that were like the one brought against Jeremy Hammond, and those people were taking pleas or were taking agreements in their case so that they could get the best possible or least worst outcome. And so I just, this court has a reputation historically of being called the Rocket Docket,
yes,
going back to the 1970s. And it really looked like the judge was going to cram as many cases as he could into this schedule. And in fact, I know that there were some that were supposed to happen while he was still doing or reviewing Daniel Hale's case. So that has really nothing to do with the subject of our conversation. But it's just incredible that when you look at our system, they had like a dozen cases in the morning that he was going to go preside over personally. And but we had this really crucial sentencing hearing in this Espionage Act case of extraordinary importance. I think before I go back to the things you said about your review, I would just take a moment to focus in on this fact. This is the first major Espionage Act conviction under President Joe Biden.
Yeah, and we sat through a number of other cases before we got to the Hale one. And it was interesting because the judge did allow people to speak in all of those cases. There was one, not to get off topic, but there was a gentleman who was incarcerated at age 16 for 18 years until his 30s, and then he was incarcerated again for a decade, and he was out on supervised release, and he's in his 40s now. He spent 28 years out of 46 in prison, and the prosecution wanted to revoke his supervised release, and he let him speak about his life and whatnot, and ultimately, said, prosecution thinks you haven't changed, but I want you to prove them wrong, and didn't revoke his supervised release, which I was very surprised by. I mean, just watching this thing where people are brought in like green jumpsuits and chains one after the other, and it's very sort of depressing to just sit there and look at the justice system. But I was somewhat impressed with the judge was actually taking time to hear from the people who were before him in a way that I know some observers were surprised by.
All right, so let's go back to some of the first things you were talking about. The prosecution gets up. This is Gordon Kromberg.
Yes.
This is the notorious prosecutor. You were sharing some details, but this is someone who I think it should be rather alarming that the Biden Justice Department has retained and kept on as a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia. He's the one who, although, as I understand it, reading some of the writing or analysis of his career, supposedly he's been used before to be a kind of shield for people with for the more bureaucratic and career employees inside of the Justice Department, because he's willing to be that ideologue or that firebrand. And so he can take all the attention, and then he deals with the blowback, and they get to just keep doing things as business as usual. So he sort of allows for them to stake out these extreme positions, and then others in the agency don't have to go through as much of a political cost. But that's what we're seeing with Julian Assange's prosecution, and then that's what we see in this case. So the thing they maintained, although they have no evidence to back it up, is that he applied to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in order to gain access to classified information. Did they ever say anything close to the truth, or did they ever grapple with the fact that Daniel himself says that he joined to get money to pay for a college education?
No, they completely reject that. I believe the defense described their story as an alternate reality. They completely claim that he, met with Jeremy Scahill, was taken with him, thought he was a rock star, wanted to impress him, wanted to be a journalist himself, and then applied for a job at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency with the premeditated intent to steal these documents. They kept saying it was premeditated. It was premeditated. He joined to do this. And per the defense, Daniel's CO applied to the job for him, or his landlord applied for the job for him. Someone else did it, and that he did it to take money for college. And they pointed out that if he had this master plan involving a journalist, he could have just taken these same documents when he was in the Air Force. He had no idea, applying for this job, which involved like mapping in China, that he would have access to information about the U.S. drone program. So if this was like a conspiracy or a premeditation to get that information, it was a very, poorly thought out one that just happened by chance to work. It was a completely preposterous assertion by Gordon Kromberg.
Yeah, and I suppose just to be a real jerk about it, and why
jerk.
not? And
Gordon
why not?
Kromberg is a jerk. Yeah.
Why not? I mean, didn't you have this case against Chelsea Manning where it was clear that people at low levels get access to some extraordinarily sensitive classified information databases? And so maybe you do have a point that, like, maybe you should reconsider allowing someone like Daniel Hale to have access to this information if they're not going to. I mean, the whole thing they always say is like, this information is outside of his job. It's not related to anything that he does. Well, then how come they haven't devised a system where he only gets access to the information that is relevant to his job? Why is he able to get into these databases that you clearly are going to jump to criminalize him over if he has access? Again, like I'm glad he had access because we wouldn't know this information, but I'm just trying to go along with the security state logic of the prosecutor.
It seems very odd that a contractor working on mapping in China would have access to top secret documents about a global assassination program that is one of the most closely guarded secrets of the U.S. national security state, in the same way that it seemed very odd that a military private had access to like decades and decades and decades of State Department cables. I'm not really sure, what's going on with their security system over in any of these entities, but
Well, it could be that they're actually lying about the sensitivity of those documents. That for the most part, the release of these documents they're not going to prevent, let's just call it what it is, the U.S. empire from carrying out its true agenda and what it would like to accomplish. So, and just to be clear here, we've got a same thing going on that we had in Reality Winner's case. There's at least one or two, they look like chat messages. If they're not chat messages, they're emails. They're referenced in the government's sentencing memo. They actually do suggest that Daniel wanted to become a journalist so he could have some of the best sex ever. And that was going to be part of the rock star life that he led. This is something I pointed out in my coverage of this. But I didn't get it myself. I encourage you to go read the New York Magazine feature story on Daniel Hale so you can see just how little he wants to be a rock star, because his as I understand it, his friends were actually pushing him for months and months and months to get his side of the story out so that it would help him combat the prosecution's lies and their attacks on his character. And he just didn't really want to do it. He had no interest in they say he did this for self-aggrandizement, and yet very few people know who he is. In fact, it's documented that he's referred to as the second Snowden in Citizen 4. And that's presented. I mean, Glenn Greenwald is sliding a piece of paper to Edward Snowden saying, this is a source we have right now. And Ed says, "Oh, I hope he's being careful. That's really risky." I'm paraphrasing, but that's what happens. And that was a point where he could have done whatever he wanted to use that as a catapult to stardom, and he didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out why Daniel Hale did not want to be in the public eye. Daniel Hale very much believes he's not the story. The victims of U.S. drone strikes are the story, and he did not want his picture used. He didn't want his case sort of publicized because he didn't want to do anything to take away from the fact that the U.S. was killing these people. And I mean, it's the total opposite of self-aggrandizement. I mean, it's one of the most conscientious, moral individuals you could know, someone who is in the crosshairs of the security state and still does not want to be the center of attention because he wants to focus on these victims of U.S. drone strikes. And for the prosecution to just get up there and accuse him of vanity, self-aggrandizement, and all these other horrible things, I mean, it's just despicable. And, the defense pointed out that, over the years, he was working as a dishwasher. He didn't become a big journalist or a big commentator. And the prosecutor, Gordon Cromberg, gets him and says, that's because he knew we were on to them. He couldn't do it. And it's like, come on, buddy.
And by the way, this thing of wanting to join this agency ahead of time to steal classified documents, that's what they said about Edward Snowden in seeking his position as a contractor. And it hasn't stuck. And this shouldn't stick against Daniel Hale. We shouldn't believe it anymore. And then we've got the secret evidence. Okay, so you're all cleared from the courtroom. We know a little bit about what this is. And I can guess, based on my experience covering Chelsea Manning's court-martial, what kind of media this is that was shown to the judge. I have a pretty good sense of what it is. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a kind of Al-Qaeda recruitment video that was played during Chelsea Manning's proceeding. There's a guy named Adam Gadon who's actually wasn't American. He radicalized and went overseas to join up, and apparently had referenced WikiLeaks in talking about this. So I imagine that this internet compilation video allegedly from ISIS, although we don't really know for sure because we can't see the evidence ourselves, but they say this. So if it's true, it's just, to me, it seems to be they're talking about having access to the documents just like us. I suppose the thing that's most important here is that Daniel Hale is not being accused of directly giving documents to a terrorist organization. No, what they're criminalizing is the fact that terrorists around the world have access to the internet just like you and me,
Yeah,
and it's something that Daniel can't be expected to control. And so if it's valuable for us to read, then I suppose there's nothing. It doesn't seem reasonable. Although I know what they're doing, I understand the game they're playing, but none of us should accept it when they throw that unsavory and violent people have access to information too. I don't think that it should be a reason not to have transparency.
Yeah, and the defense classification expert, who was ex-CIA, called shenanigans on this line of reasoning too, right? They said that ISIS had put some of these documents online, and the defense. Harry P. Cooper was the defense expert on classification. He was at the CIA from 1998 to 2017. He was the CIA executive expert for classification. And he said in his ruling that the fact that ISIS put this online, just goes to further show how it didn't actually give them a tactical advantage, because, such publication further supports my conclusions, because it's just that the adversaries treat the documents as trophies rather than something that would give them a tactical advantage, given that publication would reduce to zero any tactical advantage the documents might otherwise have. In short, an adversary who has gained a tactical advantage by receiving secret information would never publicize it. So the fact that ISIS put some of these documents allegedly on an ISIS website, it doesn't mean it had any value to them whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing. You don't gain anything as an adversary of the United States by telling the U.S. empire, hey, we know how you're tracking us. Well, then logically, the U.S. is going to come up with a different way to try and identify you. These prosecutors don't make any sense. They don't have to, though. They have it's
a very low bar for being a prosecutor.
They have this monopoly of force, so they could just bullshit their way to through their argument.
I mean, everyone was always so shocked by how terrible Rudy Giuliani's arguments were during all the election stuff. It's I thought he was a big lawyer. I was a big lawyer. And it's well, I think this just goes to what the low bar for prosecutors is, right? All of the any of those proceedings everyone was shocked by, even had a law degree. It always turned out they were a famous prosecutor before humiliating themselves in Trump election stuff.
So I love knowing that this prosecutor also said we learned nothing from Daniel Hale's revelations. I mean, obviously, as a journalist and somebody like you, who's a civil liberties advocate and who has looked at these documents, we could spend some time showing that that's false. But I'd rather point out that this is my favorite contradictory reaction to any time we get a leak. This is one that I remember seeing numerous times in response to WikiLeaks publications, that WikiLeaks has blood on their hands, but also we didn't learn anything new from these documents, which doesn't make any sense at all. How could it be new? How could it be information that terrorists acted upon that did damage to the U.S., but also we already knew this? It just doesn't make any sense at all. But again, these are prosecutors, as you say, who there's a very low bar for what they're putting forward in a courtroom.
And on that note, I would point out that a very long time ago, Alexander Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair wrote a book on the CIA and drugs called Whiteout, and there's an entire chapter in there called "The CIA and the Art of Uncover-Up." And as I was reading it, I was definitely thinking of the reactions to WikiLeaks and Snowden, and I think it bears relevancy here, where anytime there's a revelation of CIA misconduct, the CIA's response is to say, well, we all already knew this, or we learned nothing. So even though the information was previously secret, even though it was previously covered up, the CIA just pretends, and the media goes along with it usually, that, oh, nothing to see here. It's literally, they call it an uncover-up. That's how Alexander Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair referred to the CIA and media's disposition to CIA drug activities that were revealed in the 90s.
So it was really powerful to hear that Daniel Hale said something to the effect of, forgive me for taking pieces of paper instead, but basically to say, instead of taking people's lives. And I hope that if Stand With Daniel Hale they'll post his statement to the court. I know in the past, some people like Daniel have had their court statements distributed, and we should get those words out there.
My understanding is that they're going to share it as soon as there's a transcript. I know outside the courthouse, a lot of people were asking people with Daniel Hale for the statement and would it be available, because everyone was so extremely moved by it. You could tell everyone except for maybe Gordon Kromberg in the courthouse was just extremely moved by it. It was an extremely emotional presentation to sit through. At times Hale was on the verge of tears, and I do believe it will be available, and I do highly recommend people read it. I don't think it can compare to being there in the moment and hearing him delivering it in that context, but it is an extremely powerful statement. And the letter he hand wrote to the judge was also extremely powerful.
Yep.
It's very clear this is not a self-aggrandizing, malicious individual. This is someone who cannot live with the fact that he participated in a program that causes the deaths of human beings. As he said, I think all killing is wrong, but I think the killing of the defenseless is especially wrong.
Mm-hmm. So it says a lot about the perniciousness of these statements and why we need to question them. I think it says quite a bit about the lack of attention from press that prosecutors are able to get away with such character assassination as to say that he wanted to become a rock star journalist, which is clearly a slanderous claim that I think people who are concerned about press freedom should honestly take seriously, because it's actually an attack to encourage kind of leak prosecution that targets a reporter and a source. But then the fact that the judge believes this, the fact that the judge, as you're saying, incorporates this into his justification for the sentence he's going to issue, I find that very troubling. And I also think it suggests that there's a lot of work that has to be done during the cases as they unfold, so that we can make it harder for them to comfortably issue these character attacks.
Yeah, the character attacks are pretty terrible, but just the attitude towards journalism that portrays on behalf of the prosecution, like, oh, you were hanging out with journalists, like that's some sort of scandalous or low-life group of people you were consorting with. I found that extremely disturbing. There is an inherent and implicit demonization of the journalism profession in what the prosecution was arguing and saying and the way they were presenting their case. And I would definitely think that press freedom groups should be a little bit more concerned about that.
Yeah. All right. So you raised the number of mitigating circumstances, these things like the length of proceeding is really important. You mentioned when you were talking about what you observed in the proceedings, the document that the defense uncovered that actually shows something very similar to what happened with Julian Assange, in that there was apparently dissent in the Justice Department over prosecuting Daniel Hale. And I don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of specific details. It was submitted as a classified submission to the judge, but just knowing that, it's actually pretty clear because he wasn't indicted in the same way that Julian Assange wasn't indicted. It's pretty clear that the Justice Department was unwilling to back charges. It's extraordinary. I can't stress this enough. It's extraordinary to raid somebody's home with FBI agents and not follow through with a criminal case. Especially, yeah.
Unfortunately, that's very common in Espionage Act cases. I mean, in the Jeffrey Sterling case, his home
that's
was
true.
raided by the FBI in 2006. He's not indicted 2010. He's not sentenced to 2015. Thomas Drake's home is, I believe, raided shortly after the New York Times publishes the article about Stellar Wynn, a publication he had nothing at all to do with. And I believe his charges are not brought until 2010. So, I mean, the Daniel Hale prosecution is really sort of baffling on the one hand, because they search his home in 2014 before The Intercept even begins publishing these documents. And I would note that the judge, in his discussion of Daniel Hale wanting to flatter journalists, mentioned, you gave these documents to prosecute these, to impress these journalists, and they knew what would happen to you if they published them, and they went ahead and did it anyways, as though like Daniel Hale was used by unscrupulous people. It was a very sort of interesting implication. Yeah, it was a very. I completely forgot about that until just now. He said they knew what would happen to you if you published them anyways. That's something to think about, right? So it was very much very negative attitude towards journalism. But Hale's home is raided in 2014. The drone papers are published in 2015. He is then indicted in 2019, shortly after Assange is indicted. I mean, believe in this, or before the indictment, when the Assange indictment is unsealed, I believe it's the same like month period. Yeah, it's like one after the other. And then his case, of course, is resolved in 2021. So it is very typical in these types of prosecutions to go on for a very long time.
That's a good point.
Over multiple administrations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but and so that being said, it's actually incredible that the judge considers the length of proceedings as any reason to give him a lesser sentence, because often you won't find that. A lot of the times the courts show deference to these violations, and they don't grant they don't take the speedy trial requirements seriously, or they'll say, well, okay, so I mean, I know that the government claimed that there were intelligence agency interests that they were dealing with, and it was complicated, and they were trying to figure out how to pursue the charges against him, which actually came up against Chelsea Manning, and they still managed to indict and prosecute and put her on trial in a matter of a few years.
It's very difficult for a whistleblower to defend themselves under the Espionage Act. It's a very straightforward, unfortunately, the way the law has been interpreted by the courts. I mean, it does not take a large amount of time to put together a case against someone when the only thing you have to prove is this document to this other person, right? That's not a terribly complex legal matter involving multiple intelligence agencies. The fact that they spent 6 years deciding this is I would be really interested to know what the internal process looks like, and I do know there's going to be some attempts to, I believe, FOIA the FBI and the DOJ to try to get a better grasp of what happened here, because right now it's all in the classified annex, and I would love to know what that inside process was.
Yeah, I as well, along with how the insider threat program, to me, creates kind of, I think there's a little bit of a feedback loop, because these prosecutorial arguments that we're discussing here are in the training that's given to people like Daniel Hale when they take contractor jobs or when they sign up to work for the military. So, it reinforces them, like, that thing that you're talking about the anti-journalism bend of this statement, this justification for the sentence, that features in insider threat training, where they're like, be careful, journalists will reach out and try to manipulate you into being their sources.
Evil journalist.
Yeah, as evil journalists using our platforms, because I'm doing tremendously well in my mansion in the just off the lake here in Chicago. So Daniel Hale should want to be me, and also do national security journalism where you're under constant threat of surveillance by the government. So, finally, so he criticized the military for putting Daniel Hale in the position. That's sort of that's remarkable in my opinion.
Yeah. So I want to be very, very careful with what I said, but what was said in open court was that Hale had a previous mental health diagnosis before joining the military. And
you don't have to give details.
Okay.
I just think the bare fact that he's putting some responsibility on the military, in much the same way there's a lot of discussion in Chelsea's case about should she have ever been able to enlist. Was it wrong to allow her in because of some of her issues?
I mean, this also involves things that happened after he enlisted. There was another assessment, and there was a whole brief submitted under seal by a military psychologist that I believe heavily influenced this part of the decision. But it's under seal as it should be, and I don't know what's in it, but it was clearly alluded to by the judge.
So do you know where he's serving? Well, we don't know where he's going to be placed as far as was there anything said about the placement in
they asked prison? If he had a preference, and they just said this area, and the judge said okay, Virginia area. He is going to a special that's where he requested his placement.
Where were you going to say that he's getting like a medical center?
I believe they sent him. We're going to send him somewhere for some type of evaluation first in the Bureau of Prisons before sending him to where he would be housed permanently.
Okay. Yeah, because that's important for those who are tuned in and maybe don't have all the details beyond just knowing what Daniel was accused of releasing. He's been in jail since April because of this, essentially a fabrication that he intended to do self-harm. And so he's not on suicide watch, but they certainly, I can understand based on how pretrial services set him up that Bureau of Prisons they're going to do the intake and they're going to want to do a mental health evaluation.
Yeah. And I mean, it's worth pointing out they incarcerated him allegedly because of his mental health, putting people in jail, not good for mental health. He was basically in solitary confinement, notoriously bad health. And in the defense's sentencing memo, they mentioned that the facility he's being held at has no counseling services. So his counseling was actually disrupted by being held for mental well-being, which is completely perverse and preposterous.
Okay. So, and then you did the press conference afterwards, and there were some notable people who participated as well as yourself. Anything you want to say about that moment after court?
Yeah. After the court, there was a press conference. I spoke. John Karianki, the CIA whistleblower, spoke. Lisa Ling, a drone whistleblower, spoke. And then Tom Drake, an NSA whistleblower who's quite close to Daniel, spoke, as did Jesselyn Radick and his public defender. It was, like I said, it was sort of a mixed thing of emotions because, Daniel Hale should not be in prison, but a lot of people were expecting a much worse sentence than the one we got, and the fact that the government only got a third of what they were asking for, I think it's sort of a mixed emotions, I think.
Yeah, there was a dirty game that prosecutors were playing, and maybe you want to speak to this before we conclude, which is that you're familiar with the sentencing document. They asked for 9 years, but then they said that if he was willing to plead guilty to risking serious or exceptionally grave damage, that then they would be willing to consider 7 years and 3 months. So we could knock it down. I mean, as it seems with the judge, it was, he basically wasn't going to play that game. And then they also weren't going to dismiss the charges that he had left because he only pled guilty to one charge. They didn't offer a plea, so they didn't really feel like they needed to have any good faith bargaining. And yet, and they go through the entire sentencing process pretending like Daniel Hale has not accepted responsibility because, and this is their words, he accepts it's legally wrong, but he doesn't find it morally objectionable what he did.
My understanding from people who are closer to the case than I am was that the prosecution was extremely upset by the positive press coverage he got in the last 2 weeks, and that the final memo, not the first sentencing memo, but the one they submitted yesterday, where they compared him to a heroin dealer who argues that selling heroin is for the good of community. I didn't read the full thing. I saw that quote, though. It was in part motivated by this real anger at the positive press coverage that Hale has gotten in the last 2 weeks.
I do want to. So, okay. Let's do a big picture perspective, and then let me find that quote, because I do want to read it before I end the broadcast. But let me give you a chance to your big picture thoughts. I mean, you're in the middle of I should tell people you're doing this incredible, important primary sources podcast, looking at the Espionage Act, covering whistleblowers. You're digging into this subject, and so what are your thoughts on in the scope of our political administrations that we have Obama, Trump, Biden now? What do you think? I mean, maybe it's going to take some time to process and figure out what sort of impact this is going to have, and certainly we can't say how the Justice Department is going to use this case in defending their prosecutions against future Daniel Hales. But, that being said, I will put this to you. It convinces me more that Reality Winner got a harsh and unjust sentence, and that she absolutely should be released from home confinement right now, and probation should be ended. Because if Daniel Hale is going to get 3 years and 9 months in prison, well, her term was over 5 years. So everything that she's going through should end right now. Right now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the prosecution tried to do in its sentencing memo was argue that Reality Winner's sentence of over 5 years, which was extremely disproportionate to any sort of prior Espionage Act cases in civilian courts, was the baseline, and that that's the baseline sentence. And because Daniel Hale was so much worse than her, that he should get this extra harsh sentence. Which, one thing that did not happen today was that baseline was not cemented. The judge did push back on that and sort of reset things a little bit more normal. It's never normal to put someone in jail for 3 years for being a whistleblower under the Espionage Act, but not sort of cement that really sort of even more draconian route the prosecution was hoping to cement with this sentence they were seeking. I will say this big picture. I mean, Daniel Hale's prosecution, like all prosecutions of whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, is a political prosecution. Leaking information to the press is the norm in official Washington. Daniel Hale was not charged, indicted, convicted, and sent to prison for 3 years and 9 months for giving information to the press. He was sentenced because he contradicted the lies our government told about its drone program. And while the Espionage Act sounds like a law about spies and saboteurs, for over 100 years, it's been used to crush dissent, silence whistleblowers, control the flow of information. And the big through line between all of these sorts of very sometimes disparate uses of the Espionage Act has been attempting to tamper down either dissent about U.S. foreign policy or exposés of the cost of U.S. foreign policy. It's very much been about controlling information the U.S. empire doesn't want out there.
Yeah, it almost always involves the media, right? That we're especially to crack down on independent press, and to go after those who are not in the what we could call establishment media that are concerned about the access that they have to halls of power and are more easily controlled by high-ranking officials saying, yeah, well, we really don't want you to print that. Or, if you put that document out there, it's going to really cause us a stink in Washington, and we don't want you. Could you hold it back? Or could you report it this way, but don't actually publish the document so people won't be able to read it? And then the Washington Post or the New York Times or other publications have actually obliged before and done it in the way that is requested. So here, I've got this. And thank you so much for giving me your time. I know you were up early in the morning. You made a trip to Alexandria. You sat in a courtroom. Sitting in court can be exhausting. I mean, like, for one, it's exhausting to report on it, have to keep up with what's going and take notes and then turn around and write an article, but also to follow it can be exhausting. And especially when you're seeing Daniel and he's dealing with trauma and what lies before him going to prison now. So I thank you for spending some time with us to give us a rundown. And we couldn't, I couldn't be part of I couldn't tune into the proceeding. I really wished that I could have tuned into the proceeding because I was able to follow the plea hearing when he pled guilty. Due to the pandemic, they had allowed some teleconferencing where you could call in. And I actually would before I read this quote here, I would just like to say that I think that this is something that media organizations should fight for outside of a pandemic normal. I think when we're not under threat of a deadly virus, we should be asking that there's more access to these proceedings so that people can cover them. I mean, I think, it's always going to be better to be in the courtroom, but I believe you would probably share my opinion that those who are not in a certain location, unless you have the resources to travel across country, you usually miss out on these cases. So it's like, I wish that every journalist in the U.S. would have the ability to call into a number and hear sensitive cases like this, or impactful or extraordinary cases like this, and be able to report on them. So this is the this quote here, that this incredible thing that the prosecutor wrote, and people have been reading it while I gab, but I'm going to read it now. Hale has expressed no remorse for his crime. According to Hale, what he did was legally wrong, but morally right. Hale has never acknowledged the potentially serious and in some cases exceptionally grave damage to national security his actions could have caused. Under these circumstances, he cannot be entitled to a reduction in offense level for acceptance of responsibility. In analogous circumstances, no one would award such a reduction to a heroin dealer who admitted that he violated the law by distributing heroin, but simultaneously asserted that by distributing the heroin, he was helping society rather than harming it. In sum, Hale was motivated not by transparency, but by self-aggrandizement. A significant sentence, therefore, is necessary and appropriate. So, continuing the worst of the war on drugs while also perpetuating the war on whistleblowers. Extraordinarily classic. Good job.
It's just such a remarkable statement on so many levels.
It's another piece of art from the mind of Gordon Cromberg, I'd imagine. I suppose that's and that is the mark of the spitefulness that was in this prosecution. I mean, you always see these filings from people accused of leaks under the Espionage Act. They accuse prosecutors of a vindictive or a selective prosecution. But then when you see something like this, it truly speaks volumes, because it says that there's something going on beyond the law in the mind of these prosecutors. It's not just
they're political prosecutions.
They're
blatantly political prosecutions. And when we had Kerry Shankman on the Primary Sources podcast, he makes the case that in a number of these Espionage Act cases throughout history, some of them go all the way to the president. Like, they are highly, highly politicized prosecutions. They are not neutral. They are not objective. They are not about just following the law or applying the law. They are extremely political prosecutions designed with a political purpose and intent.
Yeah. So let me put your podcast up on the screen for people
Oh, thank you.
to see as we conclude. And I want to thank people for tuning in. So this is the Primary Sources podcast. You can find it at primarysourcespodcast.org. It's available at Spotify. It's on Apple. It's on a lot of the services where people get their podcasts. You've been able to speak with Daniel Ellsberg and James Goodale and Carrie Shankman. You've got some incredible guests coming. And if
Thomas
you're
Drake.
and if you're a
It's
subscriber
coming up, yeah.
to the Dissenter newsletter, I'm doing these write-ups for my paid subscribers so that I can push this out here and give it a little extra boost. It's a very good idea for a podcast. I'm glad that you're putting it all together because
your support has been very much appreciated for it.
Creates a kind of history around all of this. And believe it or not, it didn't all start with Obama. I know everyone recites the line that he prosecuted more whistleblowers than all previous presidents combined. And it seemed like under Obama, we talk about Daniel Ellsberg, and then we talk about what he was doing as a president. But there's actually a lot in between Daniel Ellsberg and Obama, and then some stuff before that. So it's really good. Well, I know you're tired.
Thank you. No, yes.
And exhausted, and would like me to shut up. So
no, I never want you to shut up, Kevin. I never want you to shut up. I love hearing from you.
No, but you're gonna wave the white flag, and like I said, I beg of you to. But yeah. So everyone, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with some more coverage of whistleblowers. And until next time, thank you all for tuning in.